I'm not on Twitter, but a friend of mine occasionally sends me things that he finds on there that infuriate him, but that he is hesitant to complain about publicly. So he sent not long ago this excerpt from a poem that was published in the recent coronavirus poetry anthology that Alice Quinn edited, and that I think has been pretty roundly mocked since it was published. But this excerpt was from a poem that I won't cite it specifically because I think I'm still not convinced that it's not satire. But in any case, it was in context or out of context in this excerpt. It was effectively offering the idea that a poem could function as a vaccine, and that really maybe it's just poetry that will save us. This is, needless to say, a just disgracefully stupid idea, but it got me thinking about this funny tradition poetry has, because there is a genuinely, there's a non-trivial sense in which poems are magic. I say that with great hesitation, but the Latin word carmen for poems is it's etymologically this is directly linked to our word charm, and it was used even by the Romans as a word both for a poem and for a spell or an incantation. The word spell is we use not accidentally both to talk about how we put together a word and to talk about how we put together a magical string of words that'll control the physical world around us. So there is a tradition. I think of the sortes Vergilianas, which was for a good long while Romans and then others after them used Virgil's Aeneid as a kind of a magical fortune telling device, where they would choose a line at random and then use that line to interpret whatever crisis they were faced with. Virgil's name, in fact, the spelling of it was altered. It should have been Vergil, Vergil, and it got changed to Virgil in order to play up the similarity to the word for wand. I think Virgus. I don't fucking know Latin, but my point is that for centuries we have conflated the difference between poems and spells. Harry Potter now is taught, a new generation and a half of kids that Latin or faux Latin words repeated in an incantatory cadence can affect real physical magic in the world, and even the words hocus pocus are linked to hocus pocus is an altar boy's joke. Hocus pocus is a corruption of hoc est enim corpus meum, which are the magic, literally the magic words that the priest says during Mass. This is my body, to transform, to transubstantiate the bread into the body of Christ. So I'm always a little torn when people talk about poetry being magic, because on the one hand, there is something not insignificant, setting aside all of the tradition mongering, about using words across space and time to affect, sometimes quite poignantly, the interior of someone else's experience. Right? That's really what the lyric tradition aims for, is to set down on paper, or sing aloud sometimes, if we're going back to the lyre, which gives us the word lyric, to set down words that will bridge the unbridgeable distance between the inside of one skull and the inside of another, and will cause another person to feel something that you have felt, to put it in kind of simple terms. And yet, on the other hand, poets seemingly without batting an eye talk about curing the fucking coronavirus with poetry. So poems are spells, but poetry is not magic. Maybe that's where I come down. Anyway, we'll talk a little bit about how this affects how we teach kids, how we talk about poems among ourselves, and how we write some of the very bad poetry that we are incessantly fucking writing. And with that, let's start the fucking show. I'm Matthew Buckley Smith, and you're listening to SLEERICKETS, a podcast about poetry and other intractable problems. So this problem of poetry being magical or not quite magical, I think there was a recent a short essay published in Poetry Magazine, it was March 1st this year, that gets at some of where this comes from. So it's an essay by Margarita Engel called The Care and Feeding of Poetry. And she uses throughout this metaphor of poetry as a kind of a wild animal, and she suggests that what we need to do most is to let it roam free while sort of making sure that it has what it needs. Really, so what becomes clear fairly quickly is that she's talking about poetry as, nurturing poetry is like bringing a wild creature indoors. We need to learn which leaves, fruits, and flowers it can eat, and which will make it sick or destroy its free spirit. In other words, poetry is an experience, not a genre. Now that's, I think, a key distinction. The genre thing, is less crucial than I think. This what matters about poetry is what it feels like, and this comes up again later in the same paragraph. She says, no two poets interpret a subject in exactly the same way, and each individual poet is likely to interpret her own poem differently on 2 different days. She might not be able to tell you what her verse means, but she will be able to describe how she felt while leading a wild creature across a bridge of words from her mind to yours. So the point here is that poetry is an experience, and crucially, poetry is about the experience of the poet. It's not about the experience of the reader, it's about the experience of the poet. Now, she is largely here in this essay talking about introducing poetry to children, and there's certain things she says that only an asshole would argue with. She describes having just an obviously despicable teacher in high school. She says, it never occurred to me as a teenager that poetry could be disdained until I was placed in a high school honors creative writing class where the teacher said of my sonnet sequence about snails that snails were not a noble enough subject for the form. I disagreed. I loved nature. What could be more heroic than a small, slow creature facing life bravely? Well, sure, we understand why one might, in a vacuum, raise an eyebrow at a poem about a snail. But good God, any teacher, it would be hard to imagine a teacher today who, if presented with a high school student who was on her own composing whole sonnet sequences about any animal, about any subject for that matter, it's hard to imagine a teacher who would not at least immediately be encouraging, who would not at least meet that with some enthusiasm. So, I mean, yeah, her teacher was obviously horrible, and she cites later in graduate school, Tomas Rivera taught me that it's fine to write from the heart, without caring about anyone's judgment, without worrying about publication, without feeling caged by expectations. Well, and again, of course, it's fine to do that. This is what people do all the time in first drafts, in diaries, in letters, or just notes to yourself. The key here, I think, is that her emphasis is all about not scaring children away from poetry. But I think there are times when there is a sleight of hand that happens, or there's a kind of a conflation that occurs. She talks several times about poetry as being like music. Here, when a teacher asks students what a poem means, the joy of hearing music might be lost, and fears of failing to interpret correctly can be triggered. Instead of what does this poem mean, I suggest asking how does this poem make you feel? Music is a fluctuating emotional experience, not a rigid formula that always produces identical results. Well, that's true. Except that, as any musician knows, music requires just extraordinary discipline and in fact the rigorous repetition of often extremely rigid formulas. The first element of practice for any musician is scales. So I think there is this interesting slippage, because in just a paragraph or so earlier, she talked about the poem as being an experience of the poet, and here she's asking, how does the poem make you feel? I think how does the poem make you feel is actually an excellent question for a teacher to ask. A far better question than what does the poem mean. We can talk more about that in a little bit. But again, it only works if the poem makes you feel something. And if the whole point of the poem is how it feels to the poet, then we're really dealing with something else. Similarly here, I think she conflates the experience of music, which can be a sort of a spontaneous surge of feeling without necessarily any clear structure to it, certainly without any discipline on the part of the listener necessarily. But that's very different than what it takes to make music. We would never suggest that all you need to do in order to make music is to be able to feel something when you listen to music. Here, we're sometimes not even asking that much of poetry. She says later, how can we as adults help children preserve their natural love of rhythm, rhyme, and other aspects of musical language? Children do have a natural love of rhythm, rhyme, and other aspects of musical language. But again, there's it's one thing not to scare kids away, but it's another to suggest that they naturally will produce rhythm, rhyme, and other aspects of musical language, when of course these things, as with music, require a great deal of practice, and often very boring, repetitious practice. She gives her "to be sure" paragraph in this essay is really, it's just sort of this gesture of acknowledgement that all disciplines require some practice. But that's really about all she says. And then she immediately follows it up by saying, if children end with awkward rhymes, adults can guide them toward other forms, such as free verse, tanka, and haiku. Well, I mean, I won't try to speak to, what, say, masters of the tanka and haiku might think about sending kids who can't master rhyme their way, as if that there's no other discipline, as if I think this is really what this really tells you, is that the first thing that most of us can recognize with very little training in poetry is rhyme. It's very easy to recognize, and it's not that hard to recognize when it's off. Though honestly, even just rhyming, even just constructing a true rhyme, takes a little bit of instruction. And she treats this as something that's all sort of meant to come spontaneously from within, and that's not her invention. That's a very, very old idea. We can talk more about in a little bit. But I want to jump now to a much better piece of writing. This is not an essay. This is a short story by Catherine Dunn that was published about a year ago in the New Yorker. This is called The Resident Poet, and this is it is a pretty delightful story. I recommend you can go to the New Yorker website and read it there. It is not unlike, and I don't know when it was written because I know Catherine Dunn died, I think, a few years before this was published. So I don't know the order of composition, but it is reminiscent of Cat Person, which of course was also published in the New Yorker and got a great deal of attention. And I'd say that the primary differences, apart from the theme of poetry, the primary differences here between these two stories are it is again a young woman who takes up in a kind of a disappointing sexual relationship with an older man who is both self-conscious about his age while sort of wielding it against her like a weapon, and who's ultimately just a totally vicious and narcissistic person. The young woman in both stories is also not no treat. I'd say that the character in Catherine Dunn's story, The Resident Poet, is probably a little bit savvier than the character in Cat Person. And, the biggest difference between the slightly older jerk in The Resident Poet and the slightly older jerk in Cat Person is that in The Resident Poet, The Resident Poet takes place some decades earlier. So the aging pseudo hipster in Cat Person sort of realizes that he knows on some level what a loser he is, whereas the Resident Poet has all of the unquestioning sense of self-importance of a white male baby boomer in his prime. So it does feel different in that way, but I think a lot of the story is about the respective performances that these characters give in kind of acting out this weekend away, this ostensibly romantic weekend away that clearly neither of them is especially pleased with, and the young woman is just at every turn clearly. I mean, she is narrating it, but she's also just clearly much more perceptive and funny and witty and a better writer than this guy. I mean, she throughout while protesting that he's the real poet and she's not. She can't even. So he says she gives a self-conscious performance of her ability to paint pictures with the language, and he responds by saying, "You really should write poetry." And her response is, "Oh, I think poetry takes different kinds of feelings than the set I've got." And she says this very deliberately. It's a walk-in line for him. He fastens on a puffy grin and slips it to me with a standard nonchalant wag of his head. A poet, he says. He does the sonorous levity so obviously. We are all such bad actors. That's a great line. We are all such bad actors. It suits this story as well as Cat Person, I would say. And then the Resident Poet follows up. A poet is a man who runs out naked into every thunderstorm, hoping to be struck by lightning. That really gets at, I think, how the characters in the story look at or want to look at poetry. It is as much a lifestyle as anything. I mean, in this case, it may be both lifestyle and identity. That the real meaning of poetry is not what any given poem might do to any given person. She barely refers to his poetry at all, though he's been her teacher and she has apparently read some of it. It's taken almost. She doesn't even bother really to denigrate him as a poet. It's almost just a given that the poetry is bad, and that it almost doesn't matter that it's bad. Like, badness is even more definition than it deserves. She does her language in this story is really delightful. He sort of pressures her to perform sexually on him during their drive. And she she says, in reaching over to his pants, she says, "This thigh is a pudding. This thigh is pudding, a pudding with a bone in it, the spoon perhaps." And then oh God, her description of trying to reach over to grab hold of him for a hand job is, "I rummage dutifully in the wool-covered pudding." That's, oof. She also, I should say, has one of the best descriptions of bad sex I've ever read here. Okay, and I think it's the reaction that's so that really nails it. So she says, "I'd describe it all, but it's just a pain. A drab fumbling like nothing so much as a poorly cooked meal that is so ostentatiously served that the diners are obliged to comment and erupt periodically with over-enthusiastic 'oh my's' and 'wonderfuls.'" So throughout the story, I should say, she's doing much of what good poetry does, right? It's evocative, it shows us new ways to use the language, brings us into scenes and images and sensations, and it makes us laugh or makes us feel something, makes us cringe. So she's doing this throughout. It sort of goes without saying that she's a far better writer than this guy. But both of them come back a few times to this sense of poetry as identity, poetry as lifestyle. Here, she gives this sort of longish description of him and her and how they both sort of relate to and think about poetry. He tells her that he has given himself. He's so sensitive. His soul is such a poet soul that he actually gave himself asthma by reading an article about air pollution, and that it's his susceptibility to that gave him this, which one imagines he kind of thinks of as almost a romantic era consumption. But here's her description of him that leads into her description of herself. "He, having been married twice and published a book of poems, having grown his beard and refused to mow his lawn, having succeeded in transforming a page of liberal newsprint into a chronic ailment, having assumed all these forms and wandered hatless in the rain, hoping to be recognized and told who he is, must continue the outline he is sketching for himself, complete the design. And I, Sally, having been mooed at by my peers, having skulked against walls and sat up nights searching through the Reader's Digest for jokes to insert into the conversations of the following day, having been for too long involuntarily good, have tapped into unsuspected energies in my current project. I have worked my way through reluctant soda jerks, potential painters, a good pianist who is studying to become a bad psychologist, a traveling daffodil salesman, which is that is a poetic vocation if ever there was one. And now, here tonight, I have searched for, if not precisely located, the cock of the resident poet. Maybe he'll write a poem about me, or give me a passing grade in English. The painters did portraits of me, though they were just pastel sketches, convenient for one-night stands. I filed them in the left-hand drawer of my desk, separated by tissue paper. The pianist, a virgin until he appealed to me, wrote a tune and played it for me in the chapel. A bad poem would fit into the collection nicely. So she is still sort of searching for who she is, but both she and the resident poet seemingly think of this thing, poetry, as being a condition, a calling, a set of accessories, furniture almost. But the poems themselves are almost never anything but tokens at most. She does have this moment where we see a little bit of a more earnest aspiration to something like maybe life as a poet or as a writer. She, having really just become utterly disillusioned with the weekend away with Mr. Lucas, the resident poet, she makes a decision. She says, "I shall read the Greeks when I get back, I resolve. Picture long evenings in the warmth of the lamplight with the frenzy of the weather shut out and even the voices in the hallway beyond my attention. I won't be driven out into the dark, searching for excitement anymore. I shall look it in the face this time, look the end in the face. So this is, a less performative, less outwardly focused vision of a kind of a calling to live in books or for books. It is still a little bit of a romantic fantasy, and that suspicion is borne out by the very end of the story when she's finally dropped off. The guy, as with the cat person, the guy is just revealed as being just totally cowardly and craven and greedy and just sort of pathetic. He finally drops her off at her dorm, both angry at her and scared of her. And she goes home. She walks inside, and she's staring at the window, but she's too close. I am too close to the window, and my reflection is a silhouette surrounding the parking lot, with the whites of my eyes rolling in the black. Ah, poor Sally, I mutter at my bleary eyes. Even when there's no place left to be hurt, it seems there is something that can be diminished, whittled away. It will probably be weeks before I can even brag about this. So it is a merciless satire and a really delightful one. Again, the story is The Resident Poet. You can find it on the New Yorker website by Catherine Dunn. But it I think does a pretty good job of enacting or dramatizing this vision of poetry as a condition or as a kind of an elusive state of being. Now, the line that the poet offers her about what a poet, his definition of a poet. A poet is a man who runs out naked into every thunderstorm, hoping to be struck by lightning. That's not just any image. That's a very specific image, and it comes from Randall Jarrell, a real and very good poet, the rare sober maniac among a field heavily populated with drunken maniacs. So Randall Jarrell's line, which is I think importantly different, is a good poet is someone who manages, in a lifetime of standing out in thunderstorms, to be struck by lightning 5 or 6 times, a dozen or 24 times, and he is great. Right? The resident poet, the poetaster in the story, hopes to be struck by lightning, but really, as much as anything, his nakedness in every thunderstorm, remember, he runs out in every thunderstorm, is that's what makes him a poet, right? It's this willingness, this vulnerability, but also this performative willingness to throw himself out into the world. If you want a very early image of a sort of a hapless buffoon, or the poet as hapless buffoon, you can look at Plato's Ion. And in Ion, Plato goes to a man who is a reciter of poems. Now, this is also key. Plato doesn't distinguish, or at least Socrates doesn't distinguish between poets and reciters of poetry. That is, in both cases, the man, the person, the poet, is just a vehicle. And the poetry, the tenor, is transmitted through him. So, whether it's transmitted because you're reciting Homer and you didn't write Homer, or it's transmitted because you are Homer, and really this is just, the muse singing of the wrath of Achilles. In either case, you just happen to be there. You're the conductor for the lightning. You didn't invent the lightning. And the reason that Socrates bothers to talk to Ion at all is to demonstrate that Ion can't account for what makes his poetry good. That Socrates is trying to demonstrate a distinction between skill or an ability to do something, and an ability to explain that thing, to account for that thing. He's going to all of these people who are expert in various ways throughout Athens. He does this in many of the dialogues to say, hey, you can do this thing very well, but I believe that you can't actually explain why you can do it very well. And Ion proves him right very efficiently. It's a very short dialogue because Ion can't really explain anything. He speculates dumbly in a few ways. But the key here is that he's able to do something. There is a thing he is able. There is an effect for which he cannot account. What is that effect? Well, there's an effect that the poem that he recites or writes or whatever, the poem that is transmitted through him has an effect on somebody. And that's the thing that needs explanation. For the poet and the college girl in Catherine Dunn's story, or for the poets and child poets in Margarita Engel's essay, poetry is an internal, at best, poetry is the experience that the poet has of loving language or loving playing with words or listening to sounds. We've really lost track of any effect on any readership or audience beyond the poet himself or herself. So I think there is some reason that this is the case. I think, as I said, neither Margarita Engel nor Catherine Dunn invented this idea that that poetry is something that happens only within the poet, and the poet as a fool or even a pompous fool, unable to account for his own work. That's a very old image. But something happens in the 20th century. I'm going to, in the next episode, maybe, or the one after that, I haven't decided yet. There's an Adam Kirsch essay I'm going to talk about that gets into some of the specific history of this. But I want to give sort of a brief treatment. I think that, so for the lion's share of the 20th century, this particular approach to teaching poetry dominated American classrooms. This is the new criticism, or the methods of the new critics, largely propagated by the Cleanth Brooks and Reverend Penn Warren's, massive bestseller, Understanding Poetry, which is still a very good guide to exactly what it advertises. The problem, and I think that I have very seldom read a criticism of the new critics that I thought was quite fair. They tend to be accused of saying and claiming lots of things that they never said. But setting that to the side for the moment, the impression that many people have of the new critics is that, and the impression that they gave, or that, was given on their behalf to lots and lots of students and teachers throughout the 20th century, was that poems are sort of the key to reading poetry is understanding what it means. I agree with Margarita Engel that this is probably not quite the question to ask, and I think it's important to remember that the new critics were trying to come up with a way to understand poems that was something other than merely memorizing the biography of the poet or digesting the moral instruction of the poem. They were trying to identify poems as sophisticated aesthetic objects, and for better or worse, the emphasis falls on a kind of an interpretation. A poem as meaning, poem as ultimately a kind of a riddle or a box to be unlocked, and you see very quickly where that becomes a problem, because plenty of people have a hard time understanding poems, or at least understanding them in the way that they're meant to be understood. I do remember as a fifth grader having a teacher read "Oh Captain, My Captain" to us over and over, and sort of hammering the point about the end of the Civil War until she finally gave up and explained to us that the captain was Abraham Lincoln, How stupid were we for not getting that? And that's I think, a classic bad result of the long time dominance of the new critical strategies for dealing with poetry. But I think there's a combination of things happen. For one, there's an emphasis that people are taught from childhood on poems as things to be understood. We have to interpret them. What does it mean? There's the poem, and then what does it mean? The question that I always fucking hated getting in school was, what is the author trying to say? Because for God's sake, I mean, if he's a decent author, presumably he's saying it. But this is the default, is what is he trying to say? There's the poem, and then next to that, there's what the poem means. And the goal is to dig into that second quantity and to identify it accurately, or at least to the teacher's satisfaction. So this thing happens where poems become, we begin to think of poems as things to be cracked, codes to be cracked. And then the other thing that happens is, of course, within really the first half, but then overwhelmingly by the middle and the second half of the 20th century, free verse dominates poetry until it becomes absolutely the given, the expectation that by the time I'm in college, in 2001, it is an oddity. And I went to a southern state school, but it was bizarre when somebody in a class or submitting to the school magazine. It was bizarre when somebody opted to write in meter and rhyme. That was considered certainly very out of fashion, but also just sort of a little bit inexplicable. So free verse, and an absolute free verse, is really the given. So what's important here, and again, Adam Kirsch is going to go into this more, but that basically, when from the outside, poetry becomes a discipline that is not only a little bit mysterious, as it maybe has been for quite a while, but also seems to have no technical requirements at all, and is meant to be interpreted or understood in this kind of almost religious way, the way that we might try to interpret scripture and puzzle over it, and then acquiesce to the determination of some authority, be he a priest or a teacher. Poetry begins to become arcane. It begins to become something that people frequently don't get. They expect not to get it, and when people do it, either they seem to be doing whatever they want. The classic "my kid could paint that" response, or whatever they're doing is something we can't account for. I think it becomes easier and easier to see poetry as something that, as a lifestyle or an identity or a condition in which the actual result doesn't matter, because nobody is responding to it anyway. That if there is a thing to account for, it is not an effect that has been produced on another person. It's a way of being that one might observe. And then it becomes really important, as with the resident poet story, to demonstrate that you're it, you fit that, you suit that, you have that style, you're a real poet, which you demonstrate not by writing anything that does anything to anybody, but you're a real poet, which you show in your clothing or in your manner of speaking or in your resistance to what Catherine Dunn calls the hypocritical bourgeois plot of sexual mores. This all brings me, I think, to a line that kept coming back to me as I thought this over and trying to plan this episode. Was a very famous line from Archibald MacLeish's poem Ars Poetica. It's a beloved poem. It was published, I think, originally in Poetry Magazine. Let me see if I can find this. In 1926. So not quite 100 years ago. 95 years ago. It was published in Poetry Magazine. So Ars Poetica obviously comes from it's Latin for the art of poetry, and so this is his kind of statement about what poetry should be, or what a poem should be. He does focus on the poem specifically. I'll just read Ars Poetica, and doubtless you'll recognize some lines, but we'll talk about them in some more detail in a moment. Ars Poetica by Archibald MacLeish. A poem should be palpable and mute as a globed fruit, dumb as old medallions to the thumb, silent as the sleeve-worn stone of casement ledges where the moss has grown. A poem should be wordless as the flight of birds. A poem should be motionless in time as the moon climbs, leaving as the moon releases twig by twig the night-entangled trees, leaving as the moon behind the winter leaves, memory by memory, the mind. A poem should be motionless in time as the moon climbs. A poem should be equal to, not true, for all the history of grief, an empty doorway and a maple leaf, for love, the leaning grasses and two lights above the sea. A poem should not mean, but be. It was that last couplet, or not a couplet, the last two lines that kept coming back for me. A poem should not mean, but be. So, Ars Poetica is a charming poem, and it has a lot of delightful sounds in it. He does a very good job of using meter and rhyme in order to make otherwise sort of mystifying statements or phrases ring really true. For all the history of grief, an empty doorway and a maple leaf. God, that sounds great. I don't fucking understand what it's saying, but if I'm to, take MacLeish at his word, it doesn't matter. He's not necessarily trying to mean anything. He's just letting us enjoy this play with language. So I think that this poem is, though, importantly wrong about some things. The first one, really. Well, there are I'll say two main things. I think this poem is very specifically and revealingly wrong about. A poem should be equal to, not true. So the poem seems to be sort of resisting the Margarita Engel's bad teacher's insistence on a noble subject matter or on the meaning of poems. This seems to be what this poem is arguing against, but a poem should be equal to, not true. That's I think that's exactly the opposite of what. I think he's got it exactly backwards there. Equal to, again, suggests that there is the poem, and then there is this other thing that the poem equals, the poem matches. There's a correspondence between two different things. And that's not true of metaphors, it's not true of images, it's not true of language at all. It's not at all how language works. Language is not a mathematical system. It's a system that requires human mind in order to have meaning at all. It evokes things. It doesn't quantify them. So I would say the poem should not be equal to, but true. Truth being sort of a loyalty, a holding, a troth, holding to things. I think again of the Greek aletheia, where truth is not so much a permanent mathematical exactitude. It's not a sum that resides forever in correspondence to some precise statement on earth. It's a revelation, a disclosedness, that truth is actually indistinguishable from the realization of truth. It's not unlike epiphany, which to me, if there is truth in poetry, it's that truth. It's the truth of feeling something as true as you read it, as you experience it. And then the real killer is the end of the poem, which I think is half right. A poem should not mean, but be. But he gets that last verb wrong. A poem should not mean, right? I do think that whoever you blame it on or credit it to, I think the emphasis on discovering the meanings of poems is an error. But the correction is not an inert a celebration of poems as static objects that exist apart from people. Poetry does not have value apart from people. It has value through people. The poem should not mean but do, is how I would put that. Because again, it's one thing if you write a journal. It's one thing if you write poetry as a way to kind of heal yourself, as a way to work through your own therapy, but that's not actually what we're talking about when we talk about poetry. What we're talking about when we talk about poetry, back to Plato and Ion, is a thing that did something to someone else. It had an effect. It made you gasp. You know, if we take the Greeks at their word, when in Aeschylus, in the third play of the Oresteia, when the Furies were revealed on stage, women in the audience miscarried. Not that that's a thing to celebrate or a worthy goal, but the point is that the poetry is supposed to have an effect on you. It is supposed to do something to you. And that's where I think MacLeish really misses an opportunity. Because he's right. He's right to resist meaning as the point of poetry, but he forgets that poems are tools, and they are tools that are meant to be used to produce an effect on human beings. And with that, I've gone on for quite a while. I'm going to stop here, and we'll take a brief break, and then I'm going to read you a poem that I think will have an effect on you, or at least has had an effect on me. So this poem is called Halloween, and it's by Gertrude Schnackenberg. I couldn't find whether it appeared in a magazine or not before, but it was published in the collection Portraits and Elegies, which I think came out in 1982. So this is called Halloween. I'll read it. I'll probably read it twice. It's fairly short. Halloween by Gertrude Schnackenberg. The children's room glows radiantly by the light of pumpkins on the windowsill, that fiercely grin on sleeping boy and girl. She stirs and mutters in her sleep, "Goodbye," who scared herself a little in a sheet and walked the streets with devils and dinosaurs and bleeping green men flown from distant stars. We sit up late and smoke and talk about our awkward, loving Frankenstein in bed, who told his sister that it isn't true, that real men in real boxes never do haunt houses. But the king of the dead has taken off his mask tonight and twirled his cape and vanished, and we are his, who know beyond all doubt how real he is. Out of his bag of sweets he plucks the world. Yeah, that's a good one. You know, it's a little bit like, I think of a very different poem, but An April Sunday is an early Philip Larkin poem, and it, I think, similarly just has such an absolutely devastating ending, and is, you know, there's some spots earlier on where it's a little wobbly, where maybe it doesn't quite have the total mastery that he had later on, and there's some spots in this poem where I think it wobbles a little. I think having the girl say goodbye in her sleep, goodbye is a word that in addition to fulfilling the rhyme, resonates with the parents' sort of sober grown-up fears, but seems a little less plausible coming from the girl's mouth. And then there's always a little ambiguity with our awkward, loving Frankenstein in bed. Of course, they're talking about him in bed. But more importantly, I think it's just a terrific poem. There are some really nice little subtleties in it. The children's room glows radiantly by, there's a line break there, the light of pumpkins on the windowsill. So what this is sort of literally saying is that the pumpkins, the jack-o'-lanterns, are lighting the room, but that construction, the room glows radiantly by, suggests that the room is sort of passing away, that even as the parents are looking at it or thinking of it, it's sort of whizzing by. It's passing into the future, going away. And that's, that is then picked up by the girls talking in her sleep, saying goodbye. But there's also a wonderful parallel disillusionment where the little girl is genuinely afraid of all of the Halloween ghosts and monsters and scary things, and she has a real fear of either a vampire, or a mummy, or a ghost, or something, some dead man, and this is make believe. It's Halloween. They're masks and costumes and pretend. And her older brother he's old enough to know that. He's old enough to know. Oh well, this is make believe. It's relax. It's not. There's nothing to be afraid of. But then we step back again to the parents, and they are, of course, are old enough now to know that it comes back around again. And this is the feeling I think I have as an adult, especially with little children, when I see the neighbors put these sort of grisly skeleton figures in their yards, or build graveyards in their yards, which I succumbed to my daughter's demands. We had a sort of a stripped down version of one in our yard, but it's just horrifying. Like as a little kid, it's either scary for my littlest daughter, or the older daughter sort of old enough that it's sort of fun and spooky. But then for me, it's just scary again. The King of the Dead is real. I started this episode talking about magic, and I spent a lot of time over the last few years introducing my older daughter to myths and stories, of religious stories, legends, and folklore from different traditions. And I don't believe in God, but as she kind of interrogated me about this, it came to me that there are sort of three sets of gods that I do believe in, and I believe in them in the sense that I think that what they are said to be or represent is pretty inarguably the case in the world. And these are the muses, the furies, and the fates. And I mean that, what I mean is that, hard work and practice can be rewarded by inspiration, but inspiration is also fickle. And no method can fully guarantee it. And no theory, psychological, neurological, or otherwise, can fully explain it. As for the Furies, there is something, there is such a thing as vengeance, as guilt. There are these deep, violent, dark, bloody feelings that come up from within us, both with regard to our own sins and with regard to others. There's something primal here, especially when it comes to certain old sacred lines. Seeing those cross, something bubbles up inside us, and it may be something that's invisible to everyone around us, as was the case for the Furies much of the time. And then the Fates are this implacable force that, without any interest in fairness or symmetry or balance, determines when our lives get cut short, and they all get cut at some point. And we can't know when, and we can't know why, and there is no why. Or if there is, we will never understand it. So in that sense, any description of the Furies, the Muses, or the Fates you could look up is hard to refute. And that's what I think about when I read this poem. The King of the Dead, the skeleton, the skeleton and the cowl with the scythe, or however you want to depict him, that's real. That's a real thing. And that's, I think, it's a fairly obvious image, but it's a very, I think, well deployed one. She says, he has taken off his mask tonight. Of course, this being a Halloween poem, that's just exactly perfect. And then one last little note. The world is one of those words like self that's just real hard to rhyme in a poem without drawing attention. Without tipping your hand, but because there just aren't that many good rhymes for it. And she's found twirled, which is maybe better than curled is one, or furled. Anytime you see furled in a poem, you're about to see whirled. But I think it's nicely managed here, because the poem is not, the rhyme scheme is regular. It's ABBA, but the meter is a little bit irregular, and or at least admits a lot of substitution, and the rhyme is often consonant rather than true. And I think as obvious as a line break on twirled should have been, I never saw that last line coming. Maybe I'm naive, but I think that was nicely handled. I also want to say I'm real sick of hearing every poem in which the rhyme is buried or muted praised purely because the rhyme is muted, as if end rhyme. And the Margarita Engel essay, I didn't even get to it, but she sort of has this passing shot at end rhyme, as if end rhyme is somehow silly or juvenile. It's not good to mute rhyme just because you're muting rhyme, but in some cases it is useful. And here I think it enhances the effect of that shock of the end of the poem. So I'm going to read this one more time and then sign off. This is Halloween by Gertrude Schneckenberg. The children's room glows radiantly by the light of pumpkins on the windowsill, that fiercely grin on sleeping boy and girl. She stirs and mutters in her sleep, "Goodbye," who scared herself a little in a sheet and walked the streets with devils and dinosaurs and bleeping green men flown from distant stars. We sit up late and smoke and talk about our awkward, loving Frankenstein in bed, who told his sister that it isn't true, that real men in real boxes never do haunt houses. But the king of the dead has taken off his mask tonight and twirled his cape and vanished. And we are his, who know beyond all doubt how real he is. Out of his bag of sweets he plucks the world. All right, that's a good one. Okay, this has been SLEERICKETS. I'm Matthew Buckley Smith. If you liked what you heard, please do subscribe, rate, review, tell a friend about it. Our music comes courtesy of Eternal, sometimes listed as Eternal Producer, and the cover art, which just got figured out, comes courtesy of Daniel Alexander Smith, my brother, which is pretty good. All right, until next time.